The first time he showed up at my door, I was covered in flour up to my elbows, my shirt sticking to my back from the heat, and my head spinning with thoughts I'd been trying to silence since sunrise. In the cramped kitchen of my rented trailer, the smell of sweet bread was the only thing that still made me believe there was beauty in small battles. My son was asleep on the couch, his sweaty little arms sprawled out, his pacifier nearly falling from his mouth. Life had become a predictable cycle of work, silence, and prayers whispered in the dark, as if God only listened when no one else was watching. Then came the knock, 1, 2, 3 times. Firm, patient, like someone in no hurry. I thought it was Mr. Davis, the landlord, ready to remind me the rent was late again. I wiped my hands on the hanging towel, swallowed the pride that had become routine, and opened the door with my heart shrunk tight. But it wasn't Mr. Davis. It was a tall man, dark-haired, with a neatly trimmed beard and a gaze that pierced me like lightning. He wore a plain dark shirt, simple, but with the kind of presence that can't be explained. It's felt. His eyes held no rush, no hunger, no judgment. It was the kind of look that sees the soul first and only then the rest. And for someone, like me, already too bruised to romanticize kindness, that was more frightening than a shout. He said my name, just that. Faith, with a calm that sent shivers from my feet to my neck. It was as if he already knew me, as if he'd crossed time or an entire desert to stand there and speak those 5 letters like they carried an ancient secret. I felt the urge to slam the door. I felt fear, shame, the weight of all I was and all they'd said I should be. But something in me, maybe what was left of the girl who sang on Sundays in a lace dress with hope in her eyes, froze and stayed, listening. Because even without understanding, I knew. That moment was the start of something even my boldest prayers didn't dare ask for. He didn't say where he came from. He didn't smile the way men do when they want to please. He just stood there, steady, hands in his pockets, with the weight of someone who'd carried many wars and won a few. I asked what he wanted, my voice sharper than I meant, like someone already tired of being interrupted by empty promises. He hesitated for a second, then answered in a low, controlled voice, as if measuring each word before letting it slip. I bought the bakery on the corner, came to ask if you still make those cinnamon rolls. And that undid me inside. The cinnamon rolls. They were what I used to make with my mother on Saturday afternoons, when life still seemed simple, and the world was divided between the smell of dough rising in the oven and the verses memorized for the next day's service. I made those same rolls now, not for joy anymore, but out of necessity. I sold them to a few church ladies who still greeted me with pitying smiles. The rest I tried to leave at the corner store, where gossip outweighed business. I didn't. No, the bakery had been sold. No one told me anything in that town since I became the pastor's daughter who fell. But there he was, talking about my rolls as if he already knew them, as if he'd smelled them before. And something told me it wasn't just about the bakery. I invited him in without knowing why. Maybe because I was too tired to keep doors closed. Maybe because he didn't seem to carry malice, just shadow. The kind of shadow that hides truths, not intentions. He sat at the table with the ease of someone who'd been at many, but rarely one so simple. He looked at my sleeping son with a respect that hurt, and when he tasted a piece of the still warm bread, I saw a flicker in his eyes. Not surprise, not pleasure, but something deeper, like someone biting into the past by accident, or rediscovering something long lost. We talked little that day, just enough for him to tell me his name was Nathan, that he needed someone trustworthy to supply the bakery, and that he'd heard I made everything by hand. I, on the other hand, shared almost nothing, just nodded, said I could deliver twice, a week, and watched him leave the same way he came, silent, steady, with a presence that lingered even after he was gone. When I closed the door, something in me still hummed. It wasn't desire, nor fear. It was something else, something nameless. But in that moment it made me kneel on the kitchen floor, forehead pressed to the cold tile, and whisper a prayer that wasn't in the Psalms, just in my heart. That night, after Nathan left, the world seemed to slow in a strange way. Things stayed in place, the creak of the fridge door, the sound of the milk truck passing too early, the muffled hymns drifting from Sister June's house next door. But everything felt suspended, like someone had hit pause on time, just to make me notice what I usually ignored. I slept poorly. Every time I closed my eyes, his image returned, sitting at my table, with that look that said little and everything at once. He wasn't just a handsome man, he was an enigma. And the problem was, I already had too many problems to deal with mysteries. In the days that followed, routine settled back, or tried to. I woke early, baked the bread, arranged deliveries, left my son with Mrs. Cleo, who cared for him like a borrowed grandmother, and headed to the bakery where Nathan now was. He didn't talk much. He gave orders kindly, listened attentively, and when I walked in, he always paused. Not long, not dramatic, just enough to look at me calmly as if trying to decipher who I was beyond the woman in an apron with cracked hands from kneading dough. And slowly, that silent routine became a new kind of prayer. Wordless, but full of meaning. Over time, he started asking simple questions about how I learned to cook, about my childhood in the church, about my son's name. I answered with the caution of someone walking barefoot on glass, not out of fear of him but of myself, because it had been a long time since I felt like answering anyone. And with him, each answer seemed to pull up another memory, another part of me I thought I'd left behind. He listened with an attention that made me forget I was the woman the whole town pointed at. It was only in the third week that I noticed the details that didn't add up. The black car parked on the curb for too long. The two men who entered the bakery spoke to him in hushed tones and disappeared out back. The way he avoided talking about his past, dodging whenever someone asked where he came from. I tried to ignore it, tried to believe it was my paranoia, a tired mind looking for problems where there was peace, but the peace was too beautiful to last. And I knew it. I always knew. Still, I went back the next day, and the day after, because part of me, the part that grew up believing every sinner deserves redemption, wanted to find out who he really was, and maybe, more than that, wanted to know what he saw in me that no one else did. It was a Friday when everything started to change. The kind of day when the sky can't decide whether to rain or clear, and the air feels heavy, charged, like a warning whispering in your bones. I'd just left the bread on the bakery shelf, as I did every morning, when he called my name. It wasn't like the other times. There was urgency in his voice, but a restrained urgency, muffled by a frightening self-control. When I turned, he already had the back door open as if inviting me or testing me, and before I could think, I walked in. On the other side, I saw a world I didn't expect. It wasn't the tidy front of the shop, nor the narrow space of the ovens. It was something else, another life, phones that didn't stop buzzing, maps marked with codes, men too serious to care about bread or customers, and him at the center, steady, giving orders with the same calm he used to choose pie fillings. It was there, in that second, that I understood. Nathan wasn't just the new bakery owner. He wasn't just the man who looked at my son with tenderness and knew when to stay silent. He was more, so much more, and so much worse. My breath caught for a moment, and he noticed. He looked at me like he'd expected that reaction, like he knew one day the mask would fall and still chose not to lie. "You're here now," he said. 3 words, and I couldn't decide if it was an explanation or a warning. I tried to step back, tried to remember who I was before all this. The pastor's daughter, the woman who sang praises in the choir, with a veiled head and a heart full of promises. But she felt so far away, like she'd stayed behind at the baptism, on the wooden pews, the last time I was called sister without sarcasm. I went home with trembling hands and a heart at war. I spent the rest of the day looking at my son, trying to find in him the purity I feared I'd lost. But the truth is, something in me had already changed, and I hated to admit it, but that change wasn't just fear, it was curiosity. It was attraction. It was something pulling me closer to an abyss I'd sworn to avoid until recently. The next morning, he knocked on my door. For the first time, without a professional reason, without an excuse about deliveries or meetings, just him, alone and tired, like the night had taken more than sleep. He looked at me with the expression of someone betrayed too often to trust easily, but still trying. I hesitated, but I opened the door, and when he stepped in, something inside me opened too, a crack maybe, a small fissure where light or darkness was starting to seep in. He stayed silent for a while after coming in, as if being there demanded more courage than he wanted to admit. He sat in his usual chair, but this time he didn't touch the bread or ask about my son. He just looked at me, and I felt like I was being pierced through, like he saw every layer of what I was trying to hide, the confusion, the fear, the guilt, but also that dangerous spark of desire I pretended wasn't there. Then he spoke, and what he said wasn't a confession nor a justification. It was a plea. If I tell you who I am, you'll hate me. But if I don't, you might end up hating me anyway. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick, slow, impossible to ignore. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't, because there, in front of me, wasn't the mysterious bakery man anymore, but someone stripped of all armor, someone carrying their sins like open wounds. And as strange as it sounds, that touched me more than any kindness he'd ever offered. I shook my head, looked down and said, "Then tell me. Show me what you want me to see." And he did. Not with words, but with presence. In the days that followed, he let me in, a little at a time, to that world I only knew from news reports and the cautionary tales I grew up hearing about temptation and ruin. It was a dirty world, yes, but with its own rules, its own pains, and strangely, its own codes of loyalty. Nathan was respected, feared, but also loved. By his men, by the community he helped without anyone knowing. He was the kind of criminal who didn't fit the simplistic good and evil picture I was raised with. And that tore me apart inside. Because the more I saw, the less I could judge him. And the less I judged him, the more I wanted him near. He never forced me into anything, never asked for more than I could give. But it was in the silence between one visit and the next, in the wordless glances, that he won me over. A gentle touch on my son's hair, a note with a verse left on the counter, a delivery of groceries to Mrs. Cleo's house, unsigned but marked by someone who knew others' needs. It all unraveled me, because it wasn't just about attraction. It was about seeing something good in the man the whole world had chosen as a villain. And that made me question everything, my faith, my upbringing, and the image I had of myself. It was a Sunday night, while I washed dishes and my son slept in his lap, that I realized what was happening. He looked at me like I was the first clean thing he'd ever touched, and that hurt, because I wasn't pure anymore. I'd sinned, stumbled, broken promises I swore to keep. But he looked at me like, even so, I was still worthy. And maybe that's what scared me most, being seen completely and still being chosen. It was a Tuesday. I remember because it was the day my son came home early from school, and Mrs. Cleo always made chocolate chip cookies. I was in the kitchen, preparing cakes for the next delivery when my phone rang. An unknown number, no caller ID. I answered hesitantly, and the silence on the other end lasted long enough to chill me to the bone. Then a male voice, dry and emotionless, said only, "He's being watched, and now so are you." For a second I thought it was a prank, but the moment I hung up, a message appeared on my phone. A photo of me and my son at the school playground, taken from afar by someone too close. The world spun. My legs buckled. I ran to the window and yanked the curtain, trying to spot anything that might reveal who was out there. But I found only the same quiet street, the same still trees, as if danger knew how to disguise itself as normalcy. When Nathan came that night, I was sitting on the couch, my son asleep beside me, a Bible, open in my lap, more as a shield than a comfort. He walked in, looked at me, and asked nothing. Just sat down slowly, with that way of his, like a man who smells a storm before the first drop falls. I showed him the photo, told him what I'd heard, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for me, for us. He stood, ran his hands over his face like he was trying to wake from a never-ending nightmare, and said, "They want to hit me where it hurts. And now, that means you." That's when reality crashed down on us with all its force. I was no longer a bystander. I wasn't just the woman who baked bread and tried to rebuild her faith. I was in it, up to my neck, and with every passing minute, deeper in that life I swore I'd never touch. Nathan wanted to send me away. For safety, he said. But I knew it wasn't just that. It was guilt. It was self-preservation. It was the pain of someone who'd learned to push away everything he loves to keep it from dying before his eyes. But I refused, because against all logic, against all doctrine, against everything I learned on church pews, I loved that man. It wasn't idealized love or clean or pious. It was a dirty, painful, real love. A love that bled. But it was mine, ours. And if I was going to run, it wouldn't be out of fear. It would be by choice. But in that moment, I chose to stay. Even knowing the price of staying might be my soul. The day it all came to light, the sky was clear. Deceptively clear. The kind of day where nothing seems threatening until it's too late. I woke to the muffled sound of tires screeching on the street, something I wouldn't normally notice. But that morning, my whole body was already on edge. Nathan hadn't answered my messages since the night before, and that, for him, was rare. He could disappear from the world, but never from me. I called, once, twice, 3 times, no answer. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I scooped my son into my arms, wrapped him in a blanket, and ran to Mrs. Cleo's, begging her to watch him for a few hours. I didn't explain, just pleaded with my eyes. She understood. She always understood more than she let on. I went to the bakery. It was closed. No sign of him, no employees. The lights off, the door locked with a chain I'd never seen before. The whole town seemed to breathe slower that day, like something invisible had settled over everything, choking what little air remained. And then I heard it, on the old radio at the corner store, between a traffic report and a tire shop aide. A voice announced, "A man suspected of leading an interstate criminal organization was arrested this Tuesday morning in a joint federal operation." The description was vague, but I knew it was him. The words hammered my head like nails. Arrested. Suspect. Criminal. It didn't matter how much I wanted to scream that he was more than that. That he read the verses I left scribbled on the bread. That he cared for my son like he was his own blood. That he looked at me like I was still sacred, even after everything. None of that mattered anymore. I walked home in silence. Each step felt like it weighed a ton. When I opened the door, I saw my son's room, his toys scattered, his drawings pinned to the wall, and I wondered when I'd let the world seep into our little fortress, when I'd traded safety for feeling, faith for flesh, light for shadow. But the raw, undeniable truth was that I still loved him, even now, even with everything. And that's why, when the police showed up that night, not to arrest me, but to ask questions, I sat in the same chair he used to sit in, lifted my chin, and told the truth. Not the one they wanted to hear, but the one burning inside me. He saved my life, and you'll never understand what that means. They didn't understand. And maybe they never will. Because only someone who's been seen as a loss, a failure, a walking sin, can see redemption where the world only sees condemnation, time. Past like a wound that refuses to close, but one you learn to live with. The town moved on, with its gossip disguised as prayers and its looks disguised as pity. The bakery was sold again. His name was never mentioned in the square, the churches, or the circles of chatter. It was as if Nathan had never existed, as if they'd erased the memory of everything that didn't fit the narrative of a town that needed to stay clean in others' eyes. But I knew. He lived. He left a mark. He loved. He wrote to me once. The letter arrived weeks after the arrest. No sender. Folded carefully and stained with something that could have been coffee or dried. Blood. It said little, as always. Just enough to say he forgave me for not hating him, thanked me for being the light he never thought he could reach. And at the end, a sentence that still echoes in my bones. You showed me even the darkest of men can love with a clean soul. I kept the letter in my Bible, between the pages of Isaiah, right where it says, though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Not because I think he was innocent, but because I believe love, when it's real, doesn't erase the past. It gives it new meaning. Today my son is older. He asks about Nathan rarely, but when he does, I answer honestly. I tell him he was a complicated man. But he taught me that loving isn't a reward for the perfect. Loving is a decision, a dive, a risk, and that some people, no matter how wrong they've been, show us what's right, with more force than any sermon. I still sit in that same chair, still bake my bread, still pray, but now I pray with my eyes open. Because I know true faith doesn't live in the comfort of altars, but in hard choices, in silences no one hears, in loves that defy everything the world calls sin. And every time I smell cinnamon rising from the oven, I remember. Not with pain, but with truth.